right, good evening and welcome everyone. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is a nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the space we are in tonight. Charis is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are 50 and a half, turned 51 in November, and we're very honored to be here to celebrate essential soldiers, women activists, and Black Power movement leadership. We're here with the author, Dr. Kenja McCray, in conversation with Dr. Crystal R. Sanders. I'll introduce Dr. Sanders first. Crystal R. Sanders is an award winning historian of the United States in the 20th century. Her research and teaching interests include African American history, Black women's history, and the history of Black education. She received her BA cum laude in history and public policy from Duke University and a PhD in history from Northwestern University. She is an associate professor of African American studies at Emory University, and previously she was an associate professor of history and the director of the Africana Research Center at Pennsylvania State University. She is the author of A Forgotten Migration, Black Southerners, Segregation, Scholarships, and the Debt Owed to Public HBCUs, which has just won the Lillian Smith Book Award. We'll be celebrating later this week. It also won the 2025 Pauli Murray Prize from the African American Intellectual Historical Society and the 2025 Outstanding Publication Award from SIG 168 of the American Educational Research Association. She's also the author of A Chance for Change, Head Start, and Mississippi's Black Freedom Struggle, which in my brain was like yesterday, but we collectively remembered that it came out in 2016, which now was kind of a long time ago. So we're very grateful to have you back with us this evening. And the woman of the hour is Kenja McCray. She is an associate professor in the Humanities Division at Clayton State University, where she teaches history. She holds a PhD from Georgia State University, an MA from Clark Atlanta University, and a BA from Spelman College. Her research focuses on the 20th century United States, African Americans, Africa, and the diaspora, transnational histories, women, and leadership. Her work has appeared in the Journal of the Georgia Association of Historians, the 60s, Social History, and the Wisdom of Ifa, an Ancient Paradigm for the 21st Century and Beyond, which is another book that we're going to celebrate, which we're really excited about. So many connections here tonight. I want to encourage folks who are watching online to feel free to put their questions in the chat at any time. And for all of you who are here with us tonight, when we come to the question and answer period, I just ask that you raise your hand so I can bring a microphone to you, because we want to make sure that our online folks can hear you. So without further ado, I'm going to kick it over to Crystal. Welcome, y'all.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. And Dr. McCray, congratulations. This is a phenomenal book. I learned a lot, and you've left me with a lot to think about. So I'm looking forward to our conversation. I want to actually start this conversation in an untraditional way. In these kinds of settings, I would normally start by asking, what led you to this topic? But I'm struck by the way that you have opened the book. In chapter 1, you open the book with the powerful quote from Amina Baraka, where she's recounting her involvement in the 1972 National Black Political Convention. And she laments that, there were lots of Black women involved. And she says something to the effect of, we were there, but nobody knows our names. We were there, but nobody knows our names. I want you to begin by telling us a few of the names. Let us know the names and stories of a few of the women profiled in Essential Soldiers, why you chose to include these women, and how their inclusion relates to your main argument.
Okay, thank you so much. And I agree, that was a very powerful thing that Amina Baraka said, really compelling. So Amina Baraka is the wife, the widow of Amiri Baraka, the poet and playwright. At one time, he was poet laureate of New Jersey, I do believe. She is the mother. He was the father of the current Newark mayor, Ross Baraka, and she was a Newark was her hometown. And if you know anything about Amiri Baraka, he had a time when he was a beat poet, living in New York City, kind of living a whole different life. And in his autobiography, he talks about when Malcolm X was killed, how it struck him and how much he thought he needed to go and do things for the community. And when he, in the aftermath, moved back to his hometown of Newark, Amina Baraka was the one who had all the connections and had all the sort of the arts that were grassroots, the arts friends, and she was an artist herself, dancer, poet, and she was a person who really helped him ground his consciousness in the Black freedom struggle, particularly in his hometown. So that's Amina Baraka. So another person I would like to include is Tayari Kwasalam. She was a founder of one of the organizations that I wrote about, Ahitiana, in New Orleans, Louisiana. It started out as a work study center, which was an educational pursuit. So in the mid to late 1960s, people in this group of families in New Orleans wanted to develop an educational program that was much more, I guess we would call it culturally competent, culturally grounded for their children, so that they didn't, the kinds of information that they got in schools really, at the very least, made them peripheral to their own lives, to their own education. And they really, she and her brother-in-law and some others in the family got together and started what they would call Dokwe Work Study Center. And that initially grew into Ahitiana, which was a larger, more comprehensive Kawaida influenced organization. She was, I picked her for to say at this time because she wrote a fair amount about women's role within the struggle for freedom and equality, the Black freedom struggle, and how central women's rights were to Black freedom and equality. And she really deftly infused Kawaida principles into her writings. And she wrote about women being essential soldiers in the struggle for freedom and equality. So I got that language from directly from her, even though another woman referred to herself and others in Pittsburgh Congress of African People as soldiers as well. It was Tayari Kwasalam who wrote. She had that pen, you know, the power of that pen that was really important to this study. And if you, again, if you know Black literature, Black arts movement, she was the wife of poet, New Orleans poet Kalamu Yasalam. Maybe I'll go to another part of the country, the East organization. On the front of the book, on the cover at the bottom, that's Martha Bright. You know, maybe sometimes people are like, oh gosh, the names, right? What are you saying? So maybe I'll give us a break from the different names. And Martha Bright, she never changed her name. The Kawaida influenced organizations had a philosophy, unity without uniformity. So a lot of people in the think about in the tradition of Muhammad Ali, changed their names um, as a signifier of their growing identity, right? Their changing identity and a growing identification with their African heritage, right? Roots. But you didn't have to. So some of the people didn't, and Martha Bright did not. And she's been really really important, critical to this study. And I what one of the methods for finding people to interview is called the snowball method in the social sciences. So initially, one of my professors at Georgia State University, Akinyele Umoja, Dr. Umoja, gave me some names because he was involved in the Black freedom struggle, in the Black Power movement. So he gave me some of his connections, and I talked with them, and then they would refer me to other people, and then those people would refer me to other people. So somewhere in the whole mix, somebody said, "Oh, you should talk to Martha Bright. We call her Bright Martha, and she's so dynamic, and she is a native New Yorker, but she now she lives in the state of Georgia, but she grew up a Jehovah's Witness. She talked about growing up a Jehovah's Witness. I tell my students in the U.S. History 2 survey this story every semester when they're thinking about projects. And I'll say, and you can write about technology, right, and how it impacts American life. Because think about this lady who I interviewed. She grew up a Jehovah's Witness, and she just talked about seeing the evening news in the late 1950s, early 1960s, and saying, I could not. Jehovah's Witnesses are a part of their faith. As part of their faith, they they remain sort of apart from political goings on in the world, right? And she said, I would look at the news and I would see the people being pummeled by water hoses in the South and all those things. And she said, I could not just sit there and look at everything that was going on in the world and opt out. And so watching these things on the evening news, seeing them, right, hearing them, changed her life. And she was, forever politically active from that time. So she was in a Kawaida influenced organization, and she worked very closely with the school children. They had a school called Uhuru Sasa, and she helped take students to see colleges and things like that. And here she's speaking at a rally where the East organization members, former members, are trying to save the building that their organization had been in. So she's very, very pivotal to the study.
And so all of these women found ways to become key figures in Black power struggles across the United States. Is that kind of a central thread about why you chose to include these women and how their inclusion is central to your main argument?
So they were all in what I define as Kawaida influenced organizations at the time. So to give you an understanding of why that's important, Essential Soldiers looks at women who were in Pan-African cultural nationalist organizations during the Black Power struggle. So if think about it, I'm a student, right? I'm trying to figure out what I want to write on, a PhD student. And I knew I wanted to write about women. And I wasn't sure which ones. I didn't think I had anything more to say about women in the civil rights struggle. I I knew I wanted to write about women in the Black Power movement. And I visited the librarian who specialized in African American history and studies. Mm-hmm. And I said, I want to write about women in the Black Power movement. She said, okay, I'll pull books and come back. And when I came back, she had a stack of books about Black Panthers. And I said, we're on to something. Mm-hmm. One, because people often conflate Black Power and Black Panthers. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I said, I knew there were other organizations. We were reading about so many other organizations. And so I went down, for the particular class that I was doing a project for, I said, I'm going to write a review essay on women in groups that weren't Panthers. Mm-hmm. And some people divide Black Power into two pots. Mm-hmm. It's a false dichotomy, like lots of dichotomies are, right? It's a false split, but it, helps people make sense of things, right? Mm-hmm. So they will put the Black Panther Party in the revolutionary nationalist pot, right? They wanted to bring about revolutionary change. And then they will put what they call cultural nationalists into another pot. And they would define them as people who wanted these cultural changes, like the name changes and changes in the way they styled themselves. They wore African or African-inspired clothing. They wouldn't, straighten their hair, as was the style in the previous decades for men and women. Mm-hmm. And they would wear, their hair in a natural style called the Afro at the time. And the reason why people say it's a false dichotomy is because that didn't mean they didn't want revolutionary change. A lot of them thought that cultural change was very important and it needed to come before any other kinds of change, or else you would end up repeating the failures of the past, right? So I said, I want to look at these cultural nationalist organizations. And so my professor said, well, why don't you look at women in Kawaida organizations? I hadn't heard of that before, or at least I didn't pay attention. You know how maybe you heard of it, but you're reading all this stuff. Mm-hmm. And yeah. So I knew about Kwanzaa, the holiday Kwanzaa, but I hadn't heard of Kawaida before. And Kawaida is the larger philosophy that produced Kwanzaa. So I'm on a hunt for women who are in these Kawaida influenced organizations. Like, what are they, first of all? What are Kawaida organizations? And then, who are the women who are involved? Mm-hmm. Because when I read the initial literature, it's focused on a few charismatic leaders. And I was just curious, what are the women doing? And so that's why I picked these women, because they had been involved in Kawaida or Kawaida influenced organizations.
So I want you to talk more, especially for the audience here and perhaps listeners at home, to explain Kawaida in greater detail. In the book, you introduce a lot of terms that many people may not be familiar with. I learned a lot about different Swahili words that have now been adapted to be used for principles and themes of these various organizations that you've written about. So perhaps you could tell us, give us more information about Kawaida principles, and also introduce everyone to Kazi. So I only know Kazi because after reading this book, but I want you to explain what Kazi is, and then we'll talk about this glossary. But first, you can just talk about Kawaida and Kazi.
Okay, so, and I haven't forgotten that you want to know how these women play into this larger idea, but I feel like we need to go through these things to even understand the idea. Okay, so yeah, there's a glossary. People who were reading drafts, reading my papers, they're like, oh wow, this is a lot. Help me out, right? With some tables and glossaries. And so I did add one. I did add a glossary. There was one particular book, Fighting for Us by Scott Brown, that had a glossary. So he, set the mold for that. And I said, yeah, let me follow his example. And that's because a lot of the terminology, or a fair amount of the terminology of cultural nationalists, is in um, you know, various African languages, mostly, I would say, Kiswahili or Swahili, which is a trade language that's spoken in Eastern and Central Africa. And so you kind of have to have something. Mm-hmm. Like you said, you have to Google it or something, right?
I told her I had Googled several of the terms.
Yeah, because if you're not familiar, which I think a lot of people are not, then you don't even know how to pronounce them, right? Yeah, much less know what they are. Mm-hmm. So kawaida in Swahili means something ordinary or everyday. How kawaida was interpreted was to be something foundational, pillars to live by, a philosophy for everyday living. And it was to help African Americans live by some greater principles than those that that oppressed them within the Western, construct, right? Within the United States, within the Western world. So there were, Kawaida initially had many more parts than just Kwanzaa, but Kwanzaa is the best known expression. Some people still celebrate Kwanzaa to this day, observe it. And Kwanzaa, the 7 Kwanzaa principles are really the 7 core Kawaida principles. And so those are unity, self-determination, cooperative economics, creativity, purpose. I'm forgetting one. I have to do them in order. I'll think about it. Something collective work and responsibility. Ujima. Yeah. So those are the 7 core principles. So Kwanzaa principles, Kawaida principles. Initially, they were called the 7 principles of Blackness.
And you talk about this 8th principle of Blackness.
I say it. Okay. Yeah, so it wasn't one. I say it was one. Okay.
Then why? Yeah. Why do you maybe you tell us what Kazi is and why you consider that to be the 8th principle of Blackness?
Yeah, like a shadow 8th principle. Okay. So in the interviews and in a lot of the literature, Kazi, people talked about Kazi. So Kazi means work in Swahili. So remember I said Ujima was collective work and responsibility, and Kazi is work. So I interpreted the way people talked about Kazi to really take the form of an emphasis on the fact that you have to have balance between collective work and personal responsibility, right? So people would say Kazi is the blackest principle of them all, and you could interpret that to mean that a lot of times people would want to talk as if they were about revolutionary change, or talk about being a part of the movement or supporting the movement, but many people didn't follow through and do things to make change, right? And so another way you could look at it too is that one of the critiques of Black Power is that it was this very rhetorical, right? People said their poems and they did their plays and they talked. A lot of bluster, not a lot of follow through, right? And so a lot of the people in influenced organizations would say Kazi is the blackest of all the principles. And so I thought, wow, like this isn't one of the 7 principles of Blackness, or 7 Kwanzaa principles that I learned, but they put a lot of emphasis on it. And I found that in doing the interviews, the women in particular talked about it a lot. It was important for them, and they really talked a lot about because I'm interested. Why are the women joining these organizations?
Mm-hmm.
Because they have the, in the literature, in particular in black feminist literature, they have a very notorious reputation for male chauvinism.
Yes.
So what I'm interested in, well, why would a woman join
Mm-hmm.
this
Mm-hmm.
organization when they have other choices? And a lot of the women talked about their reasoning for joining as if it was a form of kazi, or the hard protracted struggle that one had to do, the sacrifices that one had to make to help bring about change.
So I want to build on that what you just said, because most of a good amount of the literature on Black cultural nationalist organizations talks about the subordinate roles of women, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's been some famous Black women scholars that have written about these organizations and have also talked about the chauvinism that seems to be very present in these organizations. Yet, in this book, you're kind of pushing against that. You're saying we got to look at some of these essential soldiers and see how these women created their own versions of kawaida. I hope I'm saying that right. That did not mean that they had to take subordinate roles. They took on complementary roles, right? That's an argument. You're that's how I interpret it. You're saying that Black women tried to carve out opportunities and their own versions of kawaida that did not mean that they had to be subservient or subordinate to their male colleagues. And I want to know how that played out in practice. So these women are saying we're finding ways to have complementary roles where we can have our own form. It didn't necessarily have to be egalitarianism, but it wasn't going to be a top bottom dichotomy. How did that play out in real life? Because it's one thing to say, this is what we're doing, we're going to find ways. But how did that really play out?
So the complementary gender roles
Mm-hmm.
are that one we could debate.
Okay.
We could debate.
Okay.
Because a lot of the women, some of the women say that was, an improvement.
Okay.
The first literature, the quotable Karenga, had a quote in there that said, men and women are not equal.
Right.
That's the devil's concept.
Mm-hmm.
But then it says what we believe in is complementarity. And that means, men and women are different. That doesn't mean that one is better than the other. It's just
Mm-hmm.
that we have different roles to play.
Mm-hmm.
And some women say, and I agree, right? Because I don't want to, I'm tired of being tired, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think it would be sort of analogous to women now who I'm just hearing about this secondhand, because I'm a little old for this, but my daughters tell me about women online who are like, I want the soft life. Right. Yeah, so some of them are like, I want the soft life. I don't want to, be out on Front Street, as we would say, like the man working all the time, taking care of everything, and responsible for all the security duty. I want the soft life. And so, yes, I like complementarity, and I think that's an improvement over hierarchy.
Okay.
But let me, as some people would say, rest in my feminine over here, and you be the provider and the protector over there. But we work on understanding that even within those differences, there is equity. We may not be equal as in the same, but we're equitable. So there are women in particular. I think that's what kawaida womanism is emphasizing.
Okay.
right? So, but there are also women who said, nah, that's still that in within that difference, there's always the suggestion that women have their place and they shouldn't get out of it. So if there's complementarity and if there's this belief that women should rest in their feminine and I don't fit, I don't like dresses and someone decides, well, you're too masculine, then there's a price to pay for that, right? And so I don't agree with complementarity. I just want to deal with equality, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some of the women said, hence I decided I didn't want to reinvent the wheel. I was a feminist and I didn't throw out my kawaii, my love for kawaii. And some would say I was a womanist um of a certain stripe, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then there were these various stripes of feminism and womanism. I was a black feminist. I was a kawaii womanist. Um, so like I said, we would probably be able to debate that all night, but what it looked like on the ground was in some cases, if you follow Amina Baraka, she says to Amiri Baraka, I don't like what's happening. I don't like the polygamy. You know, the guys are coming back with what they're calling multiple wives, and that's problematic. And here's why. And she starts a women's group, and the women's group begins to lobby for more formal and non-traditional roles for women in the Congress of African People in the Committee for Unified Newark, on the Central Committee and things like that. And you do see when you look at their documents, people like a Jaribu Hill is serving on in a formal position, a formal leadership position. Um, so there's change over time, but by the mid 1970s, Amiri Baraka have disavowed cultural nationalism, and they say it can't be retrofitted for the level of equality that we're seeking. So they rebuke it essentially. So it's a really difficult. It's complicated, but in some cases, what it looks like is like you're saying. I didn't think of it as women inventing or adapting their own forms of kawaii, but in a way, if you maybe follow what a Tayari Kwasalam does and the women in New Orleans, and they in their Black women's group, it does look like a kind of kawaii that has a very very strong imprint of women and women's equality, and the utility of kawaii, at least the 7 principles in women's liberation, women supporting women, women gaining an education. So I would say like one of the current present day expressions of a Kazi leader would be a Carol B. Bell. She founded and she leads Ashe Cultural Arts Center, and I just follow it from afar. I interviewed her and I follow it from afar, and they survived Katrina and they survived, and they're thriving. Seems like, and she kept those kawaii principles front and center, but then it's very it's also very woman centered what she's doing.
So it's a womanized version of Kawanita. Being mindful of time, I want to move to methodology because I want to talk about, the research you conducted for this book. I love that oral history is such a central component of this book. So if you will talk to us about that process you can talk to us the process of all of the research you did for the book, but I am especially interested in how you told us kind of through a snowballing effect, being able to locate potential interviewees. But I want to know about these interviews, how they went, the questions, the tensions that perhaps, as many of these women are recounting their experiences in these organizations.
Okay. So I'd say I conducted about 30 interviews, and I'd say about half of them were, maybe more, were face to face. So I went to um, New Orleans, things like that. A lot of people, if they came through Atlanta, because Atlanta's such a hub, I said, "Oh, you're in town. May I interview you?" And the questions were, they started pretty general, like, tell me about your background. So there's a lot of background, sort of biographical information, like where did you grow up and all that kind of stuff. So I spent a long time cutting the book. Like, the dissertation is twice as long as this, and one of the critiques was that it read like two different books. Yeah. So hey, if anybody wants some biographical info, no. But I think maybe some difficult points. I think probably the difficult points were around the if there were instances of violence, in particular gendered violence. That was difficult. And then just the conflict. So, we have conflicts in movements, we have conflicts in organizations. It's natural, right? And then there were the added layers of the state surveillance, that Black Power activists had to endure, and then the internal conflict that was stoked by some of the state kind of what am I trying to say? There's, if you look it up, if you're not familiar, there was a program called COINTELPRO, Counterintelligence Program, that was spearheaded by the FBI. And for a while, this is going on while these organizations are trying to function. So it stokes paranoia and conflict with other groups like the Panthers. And so when I'm interviewing and people are recounting this environment, that's also difficult. And who doesn't talk to whom, and who fled what organization and went here or there. And so a few of the people wanted to be anonymous, and I had to assign them pseudonyms, even though really we don't do that in oral history.
Right. I mean, but in addition to the oral history, which was very rich, and that offered something new, I think, in respect to looking at the roles of women in these, in the Black Power movement broadly, not just with respect to these cultural nationalist organizations. But I like your inclusion of literature. The inclusion of the school curriculum materials. All these ways that we are seeing kind of the voices and contributions of women come front and center. So I do think, yes, oral history was central to this project, but you also brought in some other sources that tell a richer story. I guess I'll put it that way, a more robust story. I do want to move to the epilogue, where you discuss these Kazi leadership lessons. Are there one or two takeaway lessons that you would like to share with all of us on Kazi leadership?
Yeah. Okay. So Kazi leadership is, the reason why I call it Kazi leadership is because it's a form of servant leadership. So, like I said, the women talked about Kazi being a reason, or they suggested it, for why they did what they did. And so I said they did demonstrate a certain kind of leadership that was what I could think, and originally in the field of business they would have called servant leadership. This was important because when we look at the models that people discuss, historians, academics discuss that emanated from the Black Power movement, they're almost always authoritarian, top down, and they're often masculine. And people like Ashley Farmer have written about how important it was that women like these remade, remapped Black Power to be much more equitable. But still, I found that idea that the only model that came out of leadership model that came out of Black Power was authoritarian, top down, hadn't been refuted. And I thought that what these women did, though, it does refute it. So even when they are leaning into these inequitable, many would call them gender roles, they're demonstrating leadership. And what I mean is, if women are only supposed to take care of their men and their families and deal with what they call social organization, which included like educational pursuits and things like that. And they're starting daycare centers so that people can go out and go onto the picket lines and things like that, or do voter registration drives. And they're starting schools so the kids can get a culturally relevant education, et cetera, et cetera. And they are fundraising and they're teaching, they're the administrators of the school, and they're sustaining the schools, they're cooking, right? And the schools are some of the longest running institutions of those organizations. That's leadership. They're strategizing with how to keep the school open in some of the roughest, times, through the Reagan years, when they were seeing lots of rollback of Great Society, like grant funding and things like that they had access to before. That's leadership. And so I say it's a specific kind of servant leadership. So I didn't just say there were these authoritarian models that people talked about, and they were the only models that people talked about that came out of Black Power. And there's this servant leadership model that you can see if you really look closely at the women. But I say it's a specific kind of servant leadership. So it's people centered, like servant leadership can tend to be. And then there's that element that people are doing it. Women, it's not specific to women, but this is how I saw it. People who are Kazi leaders do it because they're doing this to get the work done. They didn't envision that they would be a leader, and that's what they started out to do. They did it to get the work done. So it's work centered, I say, but it's also African centered, because a lot of times whatever they do, they try to study to the best of their ability. How did our ancestors do it, or how do people how can we, as one person who I was talking to on Saturday say, I have these worksheets and I know that they're it's kind of hard, but I tried to Africanize them. Right? They try their best to make to work from an African centered perspective, so it makes it different. So then, what's a Kazi leadership lesson? I know we're not supposed to say it, but be inclusive. So a lot of times we start out assuming, well, somebody who can work on this project only looks like this. No, you need to make sure that even if that's the case, you make a way to train other people. If there's a leader and they look like this and they need to have these qualities, make sure you plan for succession. Train people and give people opportunities that don't look like the norm, that look like they may not fit. Help them, get them the opportunity, and tell positive stories. Right? Tell positive stories. So we often sideline people and put them in the shadows if they don't fit. And it's important to make sure we bring them out of the shadows and we tell their stories. We, as people say their names.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yes, I agree with all of that. I'm over here saying, but my example of the servant leadership, or really Kazi leadership, that just stuck with me, and I hope when all of you read this book that you will make sure that you don't skip over this part, was about the Triangle Shoe Store picket. I don't know if you want to quickly tell them about the Triangle Shoe Store picket, and the way that these women are gonna, mobilize to help shut down this business that has killed a Black child in cold blood. That was just, but the ways, I don't want to.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
The ways in which a store owner believes that this teenage boy, maybe 11, 12, has stolen a pair of shoes. He chases him out of the store, shoots him in the street, and then dares anybody to go and offer him any medical assistance. The child dies. But we see these women rally and say they're going to hold pickets to tell people they should not, be patronizing this store. They're going to make sure that they don't spend money in the store, that other people don't spend money in the store. And collectively, over time, they're able to put that store out of business. And to me, it was just a reminder. They're saying, not in our community. You are not going to get away with terrorizing Black children, with making crazy money off of Black communities, and we not do anything about it, right? And these women aren't doing it for their own gain. They're not. We don't necessarily know their names of the women who are working these picket lines or watching kids so that other people can go and be on those picket lines. And to me, it was just an example of Kazi leadership, of saying, this is what needs to be done. We are going to get it done. And we're doing this because we understand our worth, and we're not going to allow some outsider, this business owner, to come in and make money off of us, profit off of us, without even recognizing our humanity. So I mean, that was just that's why I had to turn to this story. This whole, that section, just, I had to sit with it for a while and just say, and it reminded me in the present moment, the importance of collective, of collective, I don't want to say collective art, but collective economic protest, understanding the values of our dollars and what can happen if we collectively decide that we're not going to support institutions or corporations or stores whose politics and actions are detrimental to our communities, because that's what these women were doing, right? So not trying to co-op, but that was a great example of Kazi leadership, where I was just like, yes, these women knew what needed to be done, and they did it, and they said, not in our community, not on our watch. But before opening up for audience questions, I just had one final question, and that is, why do you think people need to read Essential Soldiers, especially in this moment? Why? What can we learn from these women?
Yeah, I think the examples of leadership, at least on the national level, that are being held up now are so starkly authoritarian, masculinist, top down, that it's going to be important for us to lean into learning more about alternative leadership models. And this is a deep dive into a servant leadership model. But it's also, in a way, a call to action. So the way that the people in the book organize, in some ways, can be replicated. Even if it's just, hey, let's get a small reading group together and start to study how just a few people can change change the world, change a community, change the nation.
Or I mean, even the curricula. I like education. That's my thing. And the way they had Saturday schools, after school programs, even when they weren't in a traditional Monday through Friday schools, they found ways to pour into Black children, right? To affirm Black children, to ensure that Black children learn their heritage and their culture. That story about Snow White, changing it to coal black, and the seven, what was it?
Simbas.
The seven Simbas.
Which is Kiswahili for lion.
Just, that was a beautiful story. I mean, again, once you read the book, you'll understand, but she has this part where she's looking at the various ways that Black women tried to create culturally relevant curricula for Black children, and it talked about how most of these fairy tales, these Disney fairy tales, are very anti-Black, right? this idea of Snow White, mirror, mirror on the wall, because she's so fair, and how the story was it who rewrote it? Was that Baraka?
Amina
Yeah,
Baraka.
Amina Baraka rewrote the story to write these fairy tales in ways that are affirming to Black children. And that's not that's essential work when we really think about it, to say all these generations of children growing up reading stories, and to think about having stories that celebrate Blackness, that celebrate Black skin. I mean, that's just one of the many examples in this book of showing how these women have responded to needs that we still have today, right? We still know there's a need to find ways to affirm and celebrate Black children in particular, because of all of the hostility that they face in schools and just going about their daily lives. So,
and in this day, in this context, it's not just Black history that's being marginalized and pushed out, right?
Mhm.
But it's the more, like I said before, the inclusive and diverse history that and culture that makes America what it is being suppressed. And this does offer examples of how to still get the word out, still teach the children, still teach the people the real and true story of what America is.
Yes, you'll
And
be
can be.
amazed and inspired, amazed and inspired. And I thought, man, somebody she needs to rewrite all of the Disney, fairy tales, and offer us another version, a version that's inclusive. So thank you for this. This was beautiful. I don't know if there are audience questions.
Anybody want to start us out? Yeah, let me bring the mic to you.
Hey there. I really did enjoy the book. Wonderful stories. I have a question. You talked a little bit about the process of collecting the stories, the interviews that you did. Can you kind of talk a little bit about maybe any challenges that you had with either getting the stories from folks, the methods with which you had to go in terms of getting the stories, maybe different complications with validating, right? Is this really a real story, or is this something that's sort of like hyper, like I just want to be cool and tell this story? Like, how do you, what's that process? What was that process for you like?
Yeah, that's a powerful question. Thank you. So one, I think the stories themselves were a challenge, and that is because being a historian, the actual definition of history from a traditional Western perspective is that it should be based on the written documents that are archived. And there are many challenges to utilizing only written documents to construct history that is about women, that is about African Americans, that's just about marginalized groups, right? And with these groups, like I said, one issue was the state surveillance. So there are FBI files there, but they're not going to tell a full story or an accurate story. And then another issue is when I did interview Kalamu Yasalam, he said, yeah, we did not keep those files around. A lot of times we destroyed them because we didn't want the man to have our expletive, right? So there's that. And there were just many reasons why it was really necessary to collect oral histories, but I kept getting pushback that, well, this won't be a real history. Like, like oral history interviews, you're going to base it on interviews. Interviews aren't real history. Historians don't do interviews. Yeah. And they ask, how can you tell if it's real? So for a while, actually, there was, a robust oral history kind of program or sub kind of program at Georgia State in the history department. And we did learn some pretty innovative methods, I think. And so we learned to look at the interviews with a critical eye. One thing is you're not looking for a singular story, or you're not looking at a singular story as the gospel truth. You want to look at the stories together, right? In relationship to each other, and see how memories unfold. So if one person told the triangle story and the way the store owner came out and shot the young man or boy, he was a boy. I would say, is this person trying to just tell some fantastical story? But several people in the East organization remembered that story, and they gave enough details that I could find it in a newspaper. So you're looking for things like that to corroborate. And what ends up happening is the oral histories actually even inform me of how to read some of the textual evidence. So one story is a couple of the women in the East talked about Black Rose. Black Rose, like we made space for Black Rose to come out. And I said, Black Rose, I thought I saw something in the East, in Black News, which was a newspaper the East put out for the local community. It was an ad. Black Rose will be, styling hair, something like that. And I paid no attention to it. So the second time somebody said Black Rose, I think I asked more about it. Like, okay, so what was who's Black Rose and what was their significance? And I was told, and so then I get into this really kind of deep conversation about hair culture. And remember, cultural nationalists, one of the ways that that's important to them in terms of self-expression is to not just straighten the hair, but to embrace the natural hair and learn to care for it and learn to appreciate it aesthetically. And it's a whole thing. Like, it may sound frivolous, but it's a whole thing, a whole money making thing, a whole thing, right? You can get hired and fired and, be out of work or not be able to go into the field of your dreams because of your Black hair, right? So we could talk about that. And just talking to people helped me see, oh, wait, you need to be looking for how Black Rose is written about in the newspaper. And so since I got that, I could see Black Rose, how she was talked about in the newspaper that East organization members wrote for. But then I also saw her in the larger Black press. And so she was a somebody, right? They covered her in Ebony magazine, in an article about young African Americans, going natural. So the interviews they opened up a new avenue of inquiry in that way. They weren't foolproof or infallible, but they were helpful in that way.
Anybody else? Yeah.
That's okay. I haven't read the book before, so this might just be out of not understanding. But I think earlier you were talking about the principle of Kazi, and then in relation to critiques of the Black Power movement. Do you think you could clarify what that relationship between that principle and those critiques were?
I gave the critiques as an example of why people, activists and advocates in these organizations would emphasize work to the point where they're saying one of our pillars for living is work. Work hard, work, and we're going to remind you to that this struggle will take protracted work and it's important. We're going to emphasize that we work collectively, and we don't emphasize individualism, but we suggest that you also need to put in your own personal level of work and not hide behind the crowd, right? And so what I was saying is it could be that onlookers would say the Black Power, those Black Power kids, they're all talk, right? They love to show up in their, dashikis, the African tops, and with their afros and say a bunch of poems and then give a bluster filled speech. But what are they really doing? So that's one thing. That's what I'm extrapolating. What was in the literature, I think from Ahidiyana I think it was Tayari Kwasalam. I would have to go back and really look. But in the primary sources, I did read the larger stereotype of African Americans being lazy. That's not us. Black people are always doing work. We're always doing hard work, and we have hard work to do. Like that was a principle that was put front and center for kids and things like that. And so even their curriculum was called Darasa Kazi. So work and study.
Thank you.
To piggyback off that question a little bit, I think a lot of contemporary movement organizers are now revisiting Black Power movement and particularly honoring the discipline aspect of it, because I think there's been maybe too much of a focus on individual comfort and rest and rejuvenation and all that, and not to shade anybody or anything, but people are now kind of saying, okay, well, whether because of neoliberalism or because of genuine need to recuperate from the world, people have gotten very individually focused. And so that collective work aspect, and also doing your individual work and bringing discipline and rigor to your study as opposed to just running your mouth, is really needed right now. And so, and I think there's so many people who want to be plugged into movements, but don't quite know, like there's not an organizing principle that's accessible to people. There's not a 12-point plan for folks to get it. I mean, and there are organizations that are doing it, but so if a younger person that's interested in movement work, already doing organizing work, kind of wanted to take some things away from your book that are applicable in 2025, what are some maybe suggestions that you would say, I really think 1, 2, 3 might be some things for a young activist and organizer?
For a young activist and organizer, I think they may find inspiration in looking at the principles and their meanings and really studying the meanings and looking at how they can apply those principles to their everyday lives, because some of them are just great principles to live by, right? So creativity, like you don't have to. There's so many ways you can interpret that, right? But you don't have to just buy everything whole cloth. Like how can you use your own brain power to meet your needs or your community's needs, or your organization's needs? How can you and do it in unity, right? Like you don't have to do it alone. Let's get together and put our heads together. So yeah, I think that the basic principles are at least good to consider, if you don't think that they're great to live by. And I think it's important to look at the groundwork that these activists laid and their wins, but also where they fell short in certain ways and the resistance that they faced. So if you just did those things, I think you would learn a lot.
Yeah, what is old is new again for sure in terms of the resistance, because it's the same tactics over and over again. Did you want to say something?
I'm just speaking to like takeaways from the book. I think one of the things that was really a standout for me was this idea of the sustainability of the freedom struggle. A lot of people get caught up in the hyperbole and that kind of flash in the pan moment, but the reality that your engagement is to be protracted, and that if you're serious, and I think like you were saying with Kazi, they kind of created it almost as a barometer of how serious are you. Are you willing to do the, like you said, kawaii, the ordinary, day-to-day foundational work, or you just want to be seen and heard and look at me, I'm so revolutionary? Or will you do stuff like plant a garden, or help repair a house, or fix a pothole? Do things that benefit people on an ordinary day-to-day level, that build community, connect community, and they push people forward and help people to build a system, an identity, a way of being away from maybe an oppressive system, right? And I think that was a huge takeaway for me, was the idea that this has to last. It can't just be this rage in a cage, like a wrestling match. It's got to last. This is something that your greats are going to depend on you. The type of work you do must be earnest, focused, disciplined in a way that's going to produce those types of results, and not just look at my name on whatever, the marquee. I think that was really powerful, the way you were able to identify they were actually intentionally building their identity and their, I guess, programming around the fact that this has to last beyond them.
Beyond them and into, the next few generations, hence the emphasis on education.
I think that's a great place to wrap it up, and I want to encourage everybody to give a big round of applause.
Thank you for your question.
Yeah, thank you. So now's the time where if you want to get your book signed, you can do that. We do have more books for sale up front. We also have Dr. Sanders' books for sale. And again, she's going to be celebrated for being honored with the Lillian Smith Book Award later this week. So check that out. That's going to be at the Decatur Library. And yeah, so y'all just hang out where you are, and we will bring signing pins to you. And thanks to everybody for coming tonight. We really appreciate it. For all our folks watching online, you can click the teal button at the bottom center of the screen to buy Essential Soldiers from Charis. Thanks for watching with us tonight. All right.